The sun beat down on the unforgiving expanse of the dusty plains, a merciless hammer in a cloudless sky. That afternoon, the wind was a restless spirit, sweeping through the ramshackle settlement of Redemption Gulch, carrying a gritty cocktail of smells, sweat, horsehide, cheap whiskey, and the ever-present, metallic tang of greed. At the chaotic edge of the marketplace, beneath ragged banners that snapped and fluttered like torn promises, a young woman was shoved forward, stumbling on the hardened earth. Her name was Mai, a name that felt as delicate and foreign on this land as a cherry blossom in a desert. Her wrists were bound tight in coarse, biting rope, and her face, framed by streams of disheveled black hair, was streaked with dirt and the silent, glistening tracks of tears. To the boisterous, sun-scorched men gathering in a crude semicircle, she was a curiosity, an exotic trinket to be examined. She was not a person with a history or a heart, she was a body to be bought, another soul to be traded like a sack of beans or a head of cattle. Behind her, holding the other end of the rope, stood her brother, Wei. A crooked, self-satisfied smile twisted his lips, a stark and ugly contrast to the shared features in their faces. One hand gripped the rope with callous ownership, while the other was already outstretched, palm up, anticipating the clink of coin. He had been her only family, her protector, since their parents had succumbed to a fever that swept through the railroad camp where their father had laid steel. But the years in this harsh new country had not been kind to Wei. The lure of liquor, the crushing weight of gambling debts, and a creeping darkness in his soul had warped him into a cruel stranger. To him, Mai was no longer his sister, no longer the keeper of their shared memories from a land across the ocean. She was a final, desperate wager, his last chance to buy his way out of the hole he had dug for himself. But even more than that, she was the object of a deep, festering resentment he could no longer contain. This wasn't just about silver, it was a cruel joke, a public humiliation designed to sever the last ties that bound him to a past he now despised. "Step right up, gentlemen. A rare flower from the Orient, for your consideration," Wei shouted, his voice a grotesque parody of a showman's charm. The words slithered across the dusty ground, each one a fresh lash against my spirit. "A fine woman here. Strong enough for laundry and farm work, yet delicate enough for your more personal needs. Young enough to give you a dozen sons, and obedient enough to never speak out of turn." A wave of guttural laughter rippled through the crowd. Greedy, appraising eyes pressed in closer, dissecting her from head to toe. Mai winced, her shoulders hunching as if to ward off the physical blows of their gazes. She wanted to scream, to lash out, to run until her lungs burned and her feet bled. But her hands were bound, and her spirit, already worn thin by her brother's betrayal, felt utterly crushed. The world blurred into a haze of leering faces and swirling dust. The only sharp reality was the rough, relentless tug of the rope biting into her raw skin. "What's the price for such an exotic piece?" a grimy prospector called out, spitting a stream of tobacco juice near her feet. Wei's smile widened. He held up his hand, not for bidding, but to silence them for his punchline. "The price," he announced with a flourish, "is a mere $10. A bargain for a lifetime of service." "A joke, really?" The men roared with laughter again. $10. The price of a decent saddle blanket, or a few nights of whiskey. The insult was the point. He wasn't selling her for her value, he was declaring her worthless. Just as the prospector fumbled in his pouch, just as another man yelled out a mocking counteroffer, a figure detached itself from the edge of the crowd. He moved with a quiet, deliberate purpose that drew the eye. He was tall and steady, his worn leather boots sinking into the dust with each resolute stride. He was a cowboy, broad-shouldered and sun-browned, the kind of man whose silence spoke louder than most men's shouts. His presence commanded a space around him, a pocket of stillness in the marketplace chaos. His hat was tilted low, casting a deep shadow over his eyes, making him an anonymous silhouette of justice. But then he looked up, and the shadow receded. His gaze was as sharp and clear as polished steel, as unshakable as the distant, hazy mountains that framed the horizon. He paid no mind to the other men, their lust and their mockery. He didn't even acknowledge Wei's preening, greedy grin. His eyes, a startling clear grey, went straight to Mai. He looked past the dirt, past the fear trembling in her chest, and saw the flicker of a soul being extinguished. He saw the profound desperation she was trying so desperately to hide behind a mask of stoicism. And in that moment, for the first time in what felt like a lifetime, Mai saw something other than contempt in a stranger's eyes. She saw a deep, quiet kindness, not lust. She saw a formidable strength, not cruelty. She saw the promise of protection, not the threat of possession. The cowboy spoke. His voice was low and resonant, yet it cut through the boisterous noise of the crowd like a thunderclap splitting a summer sky. The men fell silent, turning to the source of this new, unexpected authority. "I'll take her," he said. The words were simple, but the tone was anything but. It was not the voice of a buyer haggling for goods, not a man purchasing a slave. It was a statement of fact, a declaration, as if he were reclaiming something that had been stolen and should never have been for sale in the first place. Wei, momentarily taken aback, quickly recovered his smirk, rubbing his hands together in triumph. "You'll take her? Then you'll pay her price, cowboy," he sneered, puffing out his chest. $10. Even a woman like this has a price. The cowboy didn't argue. He didn't bargain. He moved with an economy of motion that was both graceful and intimidating. He reached into his worn leather satchel, a bag that looked like it had seen 1,000 miles of trail, and pulled out not a pouch, but a single, folded bill. He unfolded it and held it up. A $10 note. He walked forward until he was standing directly in front of Wei, the space between them crackling with unspoken tension. He didn't toss the money. He pressed it firmly into Wei's outstretched hand, his grip lingering a moment too long, his grey eyes burning with a cold fire. "Here's your $10, the cowboy said, his voice dropping to a near whisper that was somehow more menacing than a shout. "For the 30 pieces of silver you couldn't afford." Wei snatched his hand back as if burned, his eyes gleaming with the victory of his cruel transaction. He shoved Mai forward with a final, contemptuous push. "She's all yours," he spat, already turning to the nearest saloon, the $10 bill clutched in his fist. Mai stumbled, her bound wrists throwing her off balance, and she nearly fell face-first into the filthy dust. But before she could hit the ground, a strong arm shot out and caught her around the waist. The cowboy's grip was firm, steady, and warm. It was an anchor in the swirling chaos of her world. For the first time in years, she didn't feel like prey. He pulled her upright with surprising gentleness, and for a moment, they stood there, the hushed crowd watching. He lifted her chin with two calloused fingers, forcing her to meet his gaze. And then he spoke, his words meant only for her, a quiet balm that began to dissolve the chains of shame wrapped tight around her heart. "You're safe now," he said softly, his voice a low rumble. "You hear me? No one is ever going to hurt you again." Mai blinked, and the tears she had been holding back for so long finally spilled over, tracing clean paths through the grime on her cheeks. They were not tears of despair anymore, but of a fragile, terrifying, and overwhelming bloom of hope. Around them, the crowd began to grumble, disappointed that the spectacle was over so quickly and without more sport. But no one dared to challenge the cowboy. He radiated a quiet, unyielding strength that warned them all he was not a man to be tested. Ignoring them completely, he took her hand, his large, warm fingers encompassing hers. With his other hand, he drew a formidable-looking knife from a sheath on his belt. The blade flashed in the harsh afternoon sun. With two swift, precise movements, he severed the coarse rope from her wrists. As the bonds fell away to the ground, a profound weight lifted from her soul, a burden she hadn't even realized she was still carrying. She was free. The word felt alien in her mind. She rubbed her raw, chafed wrists, staring down at the discarded rope in the dust. Wei, who had paused to watch, sneered from the saloon steps. "You paid too much for a broken woman, cowboy," he muttered, loud enough for those nearby to hear. The cowboy turned his head slowly, his gaze pinning Wei to the spot. His voice, though still quiet, cut through the air with the sharp edge of a razor. "No woman is broken," he said, each word delivered with quiet fire. "Sometimes she just needs someone to remind her what she's worth." Those words struck me harder than any physical blow ever had. Not because they hurt, but because they began to heal a wound so deep she thought it was fatal. For the first time, she felt seen. Not as property, not as a burden, not as an exotic curiosity, but as a person. As someone of worth. Without another word, the cowboy turned his back on the marketplace. He gently took her elbow, guiding her away from the gawking crowd, past the ragged banners and the choking dust, until the noise and the stench of the place began to fade behind them. His horse waited patiently, tethered to a post just beyond the main thoroughfare. It was a strong, beautiful chestnut with a calm, intelligent gaze, a reflection of its owner. He placed his hands on her waist and lifted her onto the saddle as if she weighed nothing at all. Then, with an effortless grace, he swung up behind her, his body a solid, protective shield at her back, his arms settling securely around her fragile frame. "Where are we going?" she whispered, her voice cracking and hoarse from disuse, sounding as fragile as dry wood. He glanced toward the western horizon, where the descending sun was beginning to paint the vast sky with strokes of gold and crimson. "Home," he answered simply. "To a place where you'll never be sold, never be chained, and never be silenced again." He paused, and then added, his voice low and serious near her ear, "The men in that town now think you belong to me. In the eyes of the law out here, that's how it is. But I want you to know the truth of it. You belong to yourself. Only yourself." His words sank deep into her weary heart, planting seeds of courage and self-worth she thought had long since withered and died. She didn't know his name, didn't know his past or why he had chosen to intervene, but in her bones, she knew she could trust him. As the horse began a steady, ground-eating walk, carrying them away from the nightmare, she dared to let herself believe. Maybe this was real. Maybe a new chapter had finally begun. She tentatively rested her head against his broad chest, listening to the steady, reassuring rhythm of his heart. And for the first time in her life, she felt safe enough to close her eyes. The cowboy, as if sensing her surrender to trust, tightened his hold ever so slightly, a silent, binding promise that the entire world would have to go through him before it could ever touch her again. Behind them, Redemption Gulch dissolved into the dust and the distance. Wei's cruel joke was swallowed by the very silence he had tried to command. Ahead of them stretched open plains, wild freedom, and the chance to build a life not of chains, but of choice. Mai's tears had dried, replaced by the faint, tremulous smile of a woman who had been shattered, but was already beginning to heal. Because a stranger had stepped forward when no one else would. Someone had seen her, valued her, and called her his own, not to own her, but to protect, to cherish, and to give her back to herself. And though the road ahead would be long and uncertain, she knew that as long as this man rode with her, she would never again have to walk it alone. The trail stretched endlessly before them, a ribbon of earth winding through vast valleys of golden grass that shimmered in the late afternoon sun. The air grew cleaner, purer, carrying the scent of wild sage and the promise of distant rain. Mai sat in a quiet stillness, her body slowly uncoiling from the tight knot of terror it had been for so long. Her wrists were free, but the phantom feeling of the ropes remained. Her heart, once a frantic, trapped bird, was beginning to find a calmer rhythm against the steady beat of his. The cowboy, whose name she finally learned was Arthur, rode with the easy, unhurried calm of a man who was intimately familiar with both the unforgiving dangers of the land and the violent storms of the human soul. His arm remained a firm presence around her waist, not a restraint, but a support, steadying her as if he instinctively knew she hadn't stood on her own 2 feet, in spirit or in truth, in years. Mai kept her eyes fixed on the horizon, afraid to speak, afraid that if she opened her mouth, the fragile, dreamlike reality would shatter, and she would find herself back in her brother's cruel grasp. But Arthur seemed to sense her unspoken fear. His deep voice rumbled low in her ear, carrying more comfort than she thought mere words could possibly hold. "You don't owe me a single word until you're ready to speak it," he said softly. "But you should know one thing, Mai. I meant what I said back there. You belong to no one but yourself. I may have paid silver to get you away from him, but the moment I cut those ropes, your life became your own again. All I'm asking is to ride beside you, to offer you shelter until you find the strength to stand tall on your own." The word stunned her. No man she had ever met, not her father, not her brother, had ever spoken of her as if she possessed the right to choose, the right to breathe freely, the right to exist as anything more than an extension of their own lives. Her lips parted, but only a whisper of air and sound escaped. Why? Why would you do this for me? You do not know me. Arthur shifted slightly in the saddle, his gaze remaining fixed on the trail ahead, but his tone carried a weight like stones being laid carefully, one by one, to build a foundation of truth. Because once, a long, long time ago, someone did the same for me. I was just a boy, younger than you are now, with no one and nothing. Beaten down, sold off for labor like I was less than an animal. And a stranger, a man named Matteo, stepped in. He didn't do it because I was worth money, or because I had anything to offer him. He did it because he believed that no soul deserved to be treated as less than human. He gave me a chance, a home, and a trade. And I swore to him and to myself that if I ever saw another soul in chains, I would pay that debt forward. I don't need to know you, to know you're worth saving. His confession was a key, unlocking a part of her heart she thought had been sealed forever. It stirred a flicker of trust in the ashes of her despair. She turned her head slightly, her cheek brushing against the rough fabric of his shirt, and studied his profile beneath the wide brim of his hat. His face was a landscape carved by sun and hardship, bearing the lines of a man who had weathered countless storms, both outside and in. But there was no cruelty in his eyes, no hunger, no avarice. There was only a quiet, resolute strength. Tears pricked at the corners of her eyes again, but this time she didn't try to hide them. I do not remember what freedom feels like, she admitted, her voice trembling with a vulnerability that terrified her. It feels foreign. I do not know what I am to do with it. Arthur's arm shifted, his hand moving to gently squeeze her shoulder. Then you'll learn, he said, his voice firm but gentle. One step at a time. One sunrise at a time. Freedom isn't something you have to earn, It's what you were born with. You've just been kept from it for far too long. The horse carried them into the gathering dusk, as the sky bled from gold into a deep, bruised crimson, and the first stars began to prick through the velvet darkness like distant, hopeful lanterns. They made camp by a small stream that whispered and chuckled over smooth stones. Arthur built a fire with practiced ease, its crackling flames throwing dancing shadows on his rugged features. Mai sat wrapped in his heavy duster coat, which was far too large for her slight frame, but its warmth and the faint scent of leather and sage seeped into her chilled bones, chasing away more than just the evening cold. She watched him prepare a simple meal of dried meat and beans, his movements efficient and patient, the movements of a man who was entirely self-sufficient, a man at home in the vast, lonely wilderness. The silence between them was no longer heavy with fear, but was strangely soothing, like the quiet, half-remembered melody of a lullaby from her childhood. When he finally spoke, his words were not a demand, but a gentle invitation. Tell me about yourself, if you're ready. Not about the hurt he caused you. Not about the shame he tried to sell you with. Tell me about the real Mai. The one who existed before the world tried to take her away. Mai stared into the fire, the flames dancing like half-forgotten memories in her eyes. For a long time, she said nothing, afraid to look back, afraid that the memories might be tinder that would cause the fragile threads holding her together to combust. But then, slowly, haltingly, she began to speak. She told him of her childhood in a small village by a wide river, of the way her mother's hand smelled of ginger and star anise, of the epic stories of the Monkey King her father used to tell. She spoke of the laughter she once shared with Wei, before bitterness had taken root in his heart like a poison weed. She spoke of her own small, fragile dream, to have a small garden, to learn to read and write English from a book, to paint the magnificent sunsets with colors she had only ever seen in her mind. The words felt strange on her tongue, like stepping into bright, warm sunlight after spending years locked in a dark, damp cellar. But Arthur listened. He listened as if every syllable she uttered was of the utmost importance. He never interrupted, never judged, never brushed off her pain or her simple dreams. He let her pour out her story like water from a cracked jar, and instead of trying to patch the cracks, he simply held the space for her to empty herself of the sorrow. His eyes remained steady on her face, his presence an unshakable bastion of support. When she finished, her voice small and raw, a mere echo in the vastness of the night, Arthur poked the fire, sending a shower of sparks up towards the stars. "Those dreams aren't gone, he said simply. "They've just been sleeping. Waiting for you to find your voice again and breathe life back into them." Something inside her broke then. Not a painful, shattering break, but a freeing one, like ice cracking on a river in the spring. She pressed her hands to her face and wept, not with silent tears, but with deep, shuddering sobs that shook her entire body. Years of unshed grief, of silence pain, of profound loneliness, spilled out into the sanctuary of the night. And when she finally lifted her gaze, her eyes swollen and red, she found Arthur still there, still watching her, his expression not one of pity, but of profound respect. "Thank you," she whispered, the word small but laden with a weight of gratitude she could barely comprehend. "For seeing me. For not turning away." He gave a single, solemn nod, his jaw tight as if holding back a tide of his own emotions. "Always," he said, his voice thick. "You deserve to be seen." The night